challenge exploded into the air before anyone had time to blink. "If you can fly this helicopter, I'll marry you." Madison Clark's voice cut through the hangar like a blade sharp enough to draw blood. Laughter burst instantly, ricocheting off steel beams and concrete floors, loud, cruel electric. Phones lifted. Smirks spread. The janitor had become tonight's entertainment. Daniel Reeves froze mid-motion, the cloth still pressed to the cockpit window of the Raven X9. He hadn't expected to be dragged into the spotlight. The hangar had always been a safe place for him, a place where he blended into the background, invisible, unnoticed. But Madison's challenge ripped the veil off that quiet world in an instant. Madison stood near the aircraft, like she owned the sky itself, 32 brilliant on paper, polished by privilege and running aerodyne technologies with an iron will. 3 years of development and more than $40 million had gone into the Raven X9, their pride, their future. Yet no one dared fly it. Not her engineers, not her technicians, not even the test pilots she'd pushed too hard and driven away. Unbelievable, she snapped, pacing before her silent team. A room full of the smartest people in the building, and not a single one willing to take a risk. The shame in the room thickened, heavy as oil. Engineers avoided her eyes, pride pinned their tongues. And behind them, Daniel watched the scene unfold like a man who had seen this exact kind of fear before, just in different uniforms. When Madison mocked them again, something inside Daniel shifted. He had heard that tone so many times, officers who confused authority with wisdom, rookies who misunderstood courage entirely. Mistaken certainty dressed up as leadership. He exhaled slowly. Maybe he said quietly, "You're looking in the wrong place." The words sliced through the room. Heads jerked toward him. Madison turned, blinking, her expression flickering from confusion to amusement to cold superiority. "I'm sorry," she said, dripping condescension. "Did the janitor just offer us advice?" "I'm saying," Daniel replied, voice, "even you might be making assumptions about who can and can't fly this machine." The engineers laughed harder. Someone actually clapped. Another whispered loudly, "He probably thinks the controls work like the vacuum cleaner." But Daniel didn't flinch, didn't shrink, didn't apologize. Madison tilted her head, studying him the way one studies something odd under glass. "Fine," she said, her voice rising. "Fly it, and I'll marry you." More laughter, cruel, gleeful, confident. Daniel met her eyes, held them, then smiled, a small, calm, dangerous smile that made the laughter falter. "Deal." A stunned silence rippled outward. Madison's breath caught almost imperceptibly. She hadn't expected him to accept. Pride, however, wouldn't let her retract the words. "Show us," she said. "Show us what you've got." Daniel walked toward the Raven X9. Not rushed, not hesitant. Just steady, deliberate steps, the kind of steps belonging to a man who had already survived far worse moments and carried scars he never spoke about. Employees drifted after him, their expressions shifting from disbelief to curiosity. He placed one hand on the Raven's fuselage, feeling the metal hum beneath his fingertips. Then he circled the aircraft, checking structural points, scanning connections, assessing the balance. Each movement was precise, professional, impossible to fake. Whispers replaced laughter. The tone in the room shifted. Something strange was happening, something none of them could explain. Daniel climbed into the cockpit. Madison's heart stuttered. He reached for the controls. Switches flicked in perfect sequence. Systems awakened one by one, exactly as they were designed to. Lights pulsed across the panel like stars returning to the sky. Marcus, the senior engineer, leaned forward, voice barely more than a breath. He knows the startup procedure. The turbine roared alive. Wind surged. Papers flew. Employees shielded their eyes. Madison stood, frozen hair whipping across her face, stunned. Because in that explosive moment with the Raven X9 rising under his command, Daniel Reeves no longer looked like a janitor. He looked like a man returning home, a man shaped by sky and fire and discipline, a man she had grossly underestimated. And as the rotor blades thundered overhead, Madison Clark felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had no idea who she had just challenged, but she was about to find out. The Raven X9 settled onto the hangar floor with the soft precision of a feather drifting onto water. When the engines powered down and the last echo of the rotor blades faded, no one moved. It was as if the entire facility had forgotten how to breathe. Madison Clark stood rooted in place, pulse hammering at her throat, her carefully constructed certainty cracking open inch by inch. Her janitor, had flown a next-generation prototype as if he had been born inside its cockpit. Daniel Reeves stepped out of the aircraft with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to far more dangerous landings. His boots touched the concrete, steady and silent, as dozens of stunned eyes tracked his movement. He didn't bask in the attention. He didn't smirk. He didn't even look proud. He merely removed the headset, set it neatly inside the cockpit, and approached Madison with the calm gravity of a man who carried years of untold stories on his shoulders. "Who are you?" she whispered. The question slipped out before she could catch it. But Daniel just offered a faint nod, as if he had expected that reaction. He reached into his worn back pocket and unfolded an old leather wallet frayed at the corners. From it, he pulled a laminated identification card, the edges yellowed with age, the surface cracked from years of being held too tightly. He placed it on the table beside them. Madison's breath caught. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Reeves, Tactical Flight Instructor, United States Air Force. For a moment, everything inside her stilled. She read the words again, then a third time, because her brain refused to accept what her eyes were telling her. Lieutenant Colonel, an elite rank, a level of trust granted only to those who shaped warriors. Her gaze drifted to his face, the calm control he'd shown, the way he'd moved the steady certainty in his hands. It all made horrifying, humiliating sense. Marcus Wilder, the senior engineer, pushed forward, grabbed the card, and as he read it, all color drained from his face. "My God," he breathed. Daniel Reeves. The Daniel Reeves. "You trained half the tactical pilots still flying combat missions today." He turned to the younger engineers, disbelief trembling in his voice. "You don't understand. This man is practically a legend." Whispers rippled through the room. A legend? He trained special ops pilots. Why would he be working here? As a janitor. Madison watched Daniel, her chest tightening with something sharp, shame maybe, or something quieter and deeper than shame. "You've been cleaning floors for 6 months," she said softly, "and you never said a word. You never asked." His response was gentle, not accusing, but the truth settled over her like a weighted blanket. But why? Marcus asked the question, breaking through the stunned silence. "Why are you doing this kind of work?" Daniel swallowed. When he spoke, the steady timbre of his voice carried an undertone of memories carved out of pain. "I needed a job. Something consistent. Somewhere close to home." He paused. "My wife passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. She fought hard, but was faster than we expected." Madison's breath hitched. "I had a daughter to raise," he continued. "Emma was only 5 then. She needed me every day, not halfway across the world. And with the injury from my last crash, the Air Force medically retired me. Commercial airlines wouldn't take me without updated certifications, which I couldn't afford. When Aerodyne posted a position for maintenance staff, I applied. You hired me. Silence thickened. Not the cold, mocking kind from earlier, but the heavy human kind that presses on the ribs. The young engineer stepped forward, face red with guilt. Sir, we didn't know. We shouldn't have. You didn't know I was a pilot, Daniel said, voice low, but edged with steel. That's true. But you did know I was a person, and you laughed anyway. The engineer lowered his head. Daniel scanned the room not with anger, but with a clarity that felt like a mirror held up to every one of them. Everyone here has a story. Marcus worked nights while supporting 3 kids. Jenna in accounting is raising a disabled son alone. Carlos in shipping lost his brother last year. You don't know the battles people fight. That's why you treat them with respect, not because of what they can do for you, but because they're human. The words struck the room harder than any reprimand Madison had ever delivered. Even she felt them settling into the places she tried to ignore, the places where ambition had overshadowed empathy. She blinked rapidly, but she couldn't stop the sting in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its steel. Daniel, I'm sorry. Truly. He shook his head, not dismissing her apology, but refusing to let it center on her. It's done. What matters is what you do next. And as the weight of that truth hung between them, Madison realized she had not only misjudged a man, she had misjudged the very foundation of her leadership. Daniel Reeves had walked into her hangar as a janitor, but now she understood the truth. She had been standing in the presence of a soldier, a leader, a survivor, and she had never seen him at all. Morning crept across the Aerodyne testing compound, bringing with it a tension so taut it seemed to vibrate in the air. The hangar, usually humming with noise and motion, felt strangely hollow, as if everyone inside were waiting for something to crack. The truth of Daniel Reeves's identity still lingered like smoke, unsettling and undeniable. And now the company's greatest problem stood fully exposed, and the Raven X9 was only 7 days from its grand unveiling, and not a single certified pilot on the payroll had dared to fly it. Madison Clark stood at the center of the hangar with a posture too stiff to hide her exhaustion. She had not slept. Her mind had replayed Daniel's calm, steady voice through the night, cutting through her pride like a scalpel. Everything she thought she controlled felt suddenly fragile, as though she had built her leadership on a foundation made of glass. The engineers gathered before her shoulders, tense, eyes wary. Yesterday's humiliation still clung to them, but beneath it was a deeper fear, the fear Madison had finally begun to understand. We launch in 7 days, she said, her voice firm, yet stripped of the sharpness she had once wielded like a weapon. And we still do not have an official test pilot for the Raven. The silence that followed was thick. No excuses, no protests. Only the weight of what was at stake. Marcus Wilder stepped forward, worry tightening his features. Madison. The autopilot system is still unstable. Simulations can only show so much. If something goes wrong during live flight, we don't know whether the manual override will react in time. He hesitated. We built something revolutionary, but we may have built it faster than we can trust it, and hiring an outside pilot isn't possible, she replied quietly. Not with the deadline we have. Her gaze drifted to the far end of the hangar where Daniel was calmly tying a trash bag and setting it aside. He moved with the quiet discipline of someone who had once been conditioned to survive chaos. Even from a distance, his presence steadied the space around him. The engineers looked at him too, though most quickly glanced away, ashamed by what they had overlooked. Madison exhaled. Yesterday we judged a man by his uniform, by the job title we assigned him. And in doing so, we almost overlooked the only person here who had the courage we've needed from the beginning. Marcus lowered his eyes. We never imagined someone like him, someone like a janitor, she interrupted softly, but the words hit the room like a reprimand. He stepped up when none of us did. The truth echoed through the hangar, impossible to ignore. Engineers shifted uncomfortably. They all knew she was right. Marcus cleared his throat. The Raven is ready, Madison. Structurally and mechanically, it's everything we hoped it would be. But readiness doesn't replace fear. And fear is what's stopping all of us. Her heartbeat quickened as she followed his gaze toward Daniel again. Fear was stopping them, but not him. He had seen worse, survived worse, led others through worse. And he had done it while carrying losses they couldn't even imagine. Madison turned and began crossing the hangar, each step pulling breathless silence behind her. Daniel looked up as she approached, stopping his work. "Miss Clark," he greeted. "Daniel," she said softer than she intended. Her confidence wavered not from uncertainty in him, but in herself. "I need to ask you something. And I know it's asking a lot." He waited without speaking, steady as always. She drew in a breath. "Will you test fly the Raven X9 for the official launch event?" For a fleeting second, she feared he would refuse, that he would remind her of her arrogance, her judgment, her complete blindness to who he really was. But Daniel simply studied her face, reading the sincerity and the weight behind her request. "I'll consider it," he said finally. Relief surged through her chest like oxygen. Behind them, the engineers released a collective breath as if the future had been suspended on that single sentence. Because now it was clear Aerodyne didn't just need a pilot. They needed the man who had already proven he could carry their future even when none of them believed he could. The hangar was still humming with the uneasy energy of the morning when the moment arrived, the moment none of them would ever forget. Word spread like a sudden gust of wind. Madison Clark had asked Daniel Reeves to consider becoming the test pilot for the Raven X9. No announcement had been made, no decision finalized, but anticipation coiled through the building like a live current. Something was about to shift. Everyone could feel it. By noon, Madison had called for an all-hands demonstration. She claimed it was to review final diagnostics, but the truth simmering beneath her composed exterior was simpler. She wanted to see Daniel near the aircraft again. She wanted to understand truly the man she had overlooked. And somewhere deep inside a place she rarely acknowledged, she wanted her people to witness what she had witnessed the night before. When Daniel walked into the hangar, conversation stuttered and fell silent. He didn't wear flight gear or even a different uniform. He was still in his janitor blues, still carrying the same quiet dignity he always had. Yet he seemed different, taller, more solid, as if the truth of his identity had reshaped the air around him. Madison stepped closer, unable to tear her eyes away from him. He nodded politely, then moved toward the Raven X9 without waiting for direction. His hands glided over the machine with an instinctive familiarity, tracing every curve, checking every latch, following a pattern no training manual had ever taught. Watching him was like watching a violinist tune an instrument only he could truly understand. Marcus whispered to a junior engineer, "Look at how he inspects the rotor assembly. That's military flight protocol. High-risk zone first, always." The junior engineer swallowed hard. He's not afraid of it. "No," Marcus said, eyes wide. "He respects it." Daniel climbed into the cockpit again, but he didn't start the engine. Instead, he studied the controls with the quiet focus of a man, reuniting with something he thought he had lost forever. The room around him faded into a hushed reverence. Then a voice pierced the stillness, "Sir, can you teach us what you're looking for?" A young technician barely out of college, face flushed with both nerves and admiration, stood near the landing gear. Daniel turned slightly, his expression neutral, yet not unkind. "What you're looking at," Daniel said, "isn't just machinery. It's a living system. You don't fly a helicopter by commanding it. You fly it by listening to it. Every sound, every vibration, every shift in torque tells you a story. Ignore those stories, and that's when mistakes happen." The technicians leaned in, absorbing every word. Madison felt something loosen in her chest. Respect. Genuine, reverent respect, not inspired by authority, but earned through truth and experience. She had wanted them to see him. Now they finally did. Daniel stepped back out of the cockpit and stood beside the Raven X-9, commanding the space, without raising his voice, without needing a title, without trying. "If you want this machine to fly safely next week," he said, "you shouldn't just understand its systems. You should understand its potential." "And do you believe it has that potential?" Madison asked, unable to keep the question from slipping out. Daniel met her eyes. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a weight, a challenge, a promise. "Yes," he said, "I do." The hangar exhaled collectively. Madison didn't smile, but something warm flickered beneath her composure. "Daniel, if you choose to fly it for the launch, I want you to know one thing. Not because of your past, not because we're desperate, but because you're the only one who treats this aircraft and this team the way a true pilot should." Daniel didn't look proud. He looked steady, grounded, whole. "I haven't decided yet," he replied quietly. "But I'll give you my answer soon." And with that single sentence, everyone understood. The future of Aerodyne and the future of the Raven X-9 now rested in the hands of a man they had once dismissed without a second glance. A man who might just save them all. The morning broke sharp and metallic, the kind of cold that made steel sing and breath turn to smoke. Yet inside the Aerodyne testing facility, something heavier than winter hung in the air, anticipation mixed with dread. The future of the Raven X-9. A machine worth more than entire neighborhoods rested on the shoulders of a man the company barely acknowledged. Daniel Reeves arrived before sunrise, quiet as always, his steps steady, disciplined, almost measured. No one knew how much today mattered to him. Not even he fully understood it. Madison Clark, meanwhile, stood near the aircraft with arms crossed tightly against her chest. She didn't look like the ruthless CEO she had been days earlier. Something in her posture had softened, cracked open by everything she'd seen. She tried to hide it under the veneer of authority, but her eyes kept drifting toward Daniel with worry, curiosity, and a guilt she wasn't used to carrying. When he approached, she lifted her chin, but her voice wasn't as controlled as she intended. "Did you decide?" He followed her gaze toward the Raven X-9. Its dark frame gleamed under the hangar lights like a predator waiting to be unchained. "I did," he said, his voice calm but weighted by something deeper. "I'll fly it." Relief washed through Madison so quickly, she felt dizzy. Yet she sensed it instantly. This wasn't just a simple agreement. It was a man stepping back into a world he had deliberately left behind, a world stitched with pain memory and ghosts. By the time the engineers gathered, Daniel was already halfway through the pre-flight inspection. His movements, precise, practiced, almost ritualistic, left them speechless. He touched every bolt, every seam, every panel with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime taming the skies. The engineers exchanged looks, some anxious, some ashamed, some mesmerized. Madison simply watched her chest tightening with a strange warmth she couldn't name. When Daniel climbed into the cockpit, the hangar fell into reverent silence. The turbine ignited with a rising roar, wind ripping loose papers off tables. The Raven X9 lifted first inches, then feet, then into a perfect, effortless hover. Then Daniel pushed it higher, banking smoothly into an ascent so fluid it looked choreographed. But outside in the open sky, the machine came alive. The Raven danced between clouds, slicing the air with maneuvers that startled even the experienced engineers watching from below. Tactical rolls, tight spirals, controlled drops, movements only a military pilot with years carved into his skin could perform. For Daniel, every turn felt like touching an old scar. Familiar, painful, necessary. Down below, Madison's heart pounded against her ribs. She couldn't look away. Every second the helicopter cut through the sky felt like a truth being revealed, not just about him, but about herself. About the arrogance that had blinded her, about the power of quiet people she had never bothered to see. And then, as gently as if landing a bird on a branch, Daniel brought the Raven back home. The skids kissed the concrete without a sound. Silence swept across the facility. When he stepped out, everyone stared at him with a reverence that bordered on awe. Madison walked toward him, slowly, breath-shallow words tangled somewhere between admiration and apology. She had wanted a spectacle. She had gotten a revelation. Daniel simply wiped a thin line of engine dust from his hand and looked at her with steady, unpretentious eyes. He had just rewritten every assumption in this building restored dignity no one had granted him, and proven without ever boasting that real power does not shout, it reveals itself in the moment it is needed most. And for the first time in her life, Madison Clark understood what leadership actually looked like. Not dominance, not fear, but a man who carried the sky inside him, even while sweeping floors. The video went viral before the sun even finished rising. One shaky recording taken by a young intern with trembling hands swept across social media like wildfire. CEO mocks janitor, then he flies a prototype, like a military legend. The caption alone ignited the first spark, but the footage, that was the explosion. Within hours, millions of strangers watched Daniel Reeves step calmly into a helicopter worth more than $25 million and command it with the precision of a seasoned ace. They watched Madison Clark's smirk fall away. They watched a room full of engineers freeze in disbelief. They watched a man the world dismissed reclaim the sky. By noon, Aerodyne's public relations team was drowning. Phones rang nonstop, journalists demanding statements, investors asking questions, board members insisting on explanations. And beneath the chaos, whispers spread through the company corridors with startling speed. Everyone wanted to talk about the janitor who had just humiliated the entire leadership team without raising his voice. The engineers, once proud and dismissive, now walked the halls with lowered heads. Shame followed them like a shadow. Some had replayed the recording again and again, hearing their own laughter in the background, ugly, sharp, unforgiving, and now they couldn't silence it. Marcus Wilder, the senior engineer, carried the weight hardest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's calm expression as they mocked him. Every time he opened them, he saw the Raven X9 soaring against the sky with a grace that should have humbled them all long before this. Outside the building, however, the world praised Daniel as if he had emerged from legend. Former pilots recognized the tactical maneuvers instantly. Aviation forums erupted with detailed analyses, dissecting his flight frame by frame. "Who is he?" headlines asked. "Why is a man of this caliber working as a janitor?" And beneath all the noise lay a quieter, sharper question. How many more people like him do we walk past every day without seeing Madison Clark read every headline, every comment, every breathless analysis? She didn't intend to, But shame has a way of grabbing people by the chin and forcing them to face what they'd rather ignore. She watched the viral clip alone in her office, replaying the moment she told Daniel, "Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you." She heard her own voice dripping with arrogance. She watched her own expression twisted with mockery. And when she reached the moment Daniel said deal, her stomach tightened until she had to grip the edge of her desk to steady herself. For the first time in her career, Madison saw herself not through her own eyes, but through the world's, and the reflection was unforgiving. She had inherited Aerodyne Corporation, but she'd done nothing to earn respect. She had led with efficiency, but never with empathy. She treated titles as hierarchies of worth, and in doing so, she had reduced people, real people, to background noise. Daniel Reeves, however, had changed everything with a single act of truth. He hadn't meant to expose her. He hadn't taken revenge. He simply revealed who he truly was, and the contrast cut through her like a blade. By late afternoon, a quiet tension simmered through the headquarters. It wasn't anger, it was anticipation. Rumor had already spread that Madison was preparing to address the entire company. When the announcement finally chimed through the intercom, all staff report to the main hall, employees began gathering with a mix of dread and hope. Daniel stood near the back as he always did, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed. Not out of indifference. He simply wasn't a man who sought attention. Emma, his daughter, had begged him that morning not to let the mean people bother him, and he'd kissed her forehead, promising he wouldn't. Madison walked to the podium with a composure that surprised even her. But when she looked out at the sea of faces she had overlooked, underestimated, or intimidated, the truth settled heavily in her chest. Her voice trembled only once. "The last 48 hours have shown me something I should have known long ago. Titles don't define worth. Uniforms don't reveal who a person truly is. And I, more than anyone, have forgotten that." Murmurs rippled across the room. I judged a man because of his job. I mocked him publicly. I embarrassed my team, my company, and myself. She paused, steadying her breath. And that man responded with grace I didn't deserve. She turned toward Daniel, the room following her gaze. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, but her words filled the hall like thunder. "Not as your employer, as a human being." Daniel didn't bow his head. He didn't look triumphant. He simply nodded once, a gesture of acceptance, without pride. But Madison wasn't finished. "This company will change beginning today." The entire hall went still. Service staff will receive a 30% wage increase. All employees, regardless of position, will meet with management quarterly, and we will establish a scholarship fund for anyone seeking additional training or education. No more invisible people. Not in my building. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then applause erupted, quiet at first, then rising, then thundering through the hall, until the walls themselves seemed to shake. And through it all, Daniel stood silent, steady, unmoved by the storm of attention around him. He didn't need applause. He didn't need vindication. He had already proven who he was. And now, at last, the world was learning to see him. The next week unfolded with a sense of anticipation that felt almost electric. Aerodyne's headquarters had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Conversations were quieter, glances softer, and the usual invisible lines separating service staff from engineers, executives, and managers had begun to fade. And at the center of this transformation stood Daniel Reeves, a man who tried unsuccessfully to avoid becoming the symbol everyone suddenly needed. On Monday morning, Daniel arrived for what he assumed would be a normal shift, wearing the same navy blue janitor uniform he'd worn for months. But the moment he stepped into the cafeteria for his usual cup of coffee, he stopped short. Every person in the room rose to their feet. Engineers, technicians, interns, administrators, people. He had emptied trash cans for people who had never learned his name, stood and applauded, not out of spectacle, not out of pity, but out of respect. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. He hadn't been applauded like this since his days in the military, and back then the applause had been for missions completed, for teams brought home alive. This applause, however, was different. It was personal. It saw him. He tried to wave them off. "I'm just here to work," he murmured, but someone pressed a fresh cup of coffee into his hands before he could protest. Another offered him a seat. Marcus Wilder, the senior engineer, stepped forward with a sincerity that tightened Daniel's jaw. Sir Marcus said, "I'm sorry for the way we treated you, for the things we said, for not seeing you." Daniel studied him and then nodded once. "Just treat the next man better than you treated me. That's all the apology I need." And with that, the tension broke. The room exhaled. People smiled. Small steps toward redemption had begun. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself summoned to Madison Clark's office, not as a reprimand, but as an invitation. When he entered, Madison wasn't seated behind her desk. She stood by the window, overlooking the airfield, watching technicians prepare the Raven X9 for the official launch event. "I wanted to thank you again," she said without turning. "Not for the flight, for holding this company accountable, for holding me accountable." Daniel remained silent. He sensed she needed to unburden herself, and he wasn't one to interrupt someone finally learning how to be human. Madison turned her eyes clearer than they had been in days. "When my father ran this company, he taught me many things, but empathy was not one of them. I learned to measure people by output, not character, efficiency, not heart. You—" She paused as if the words carried weight she wasn't used to lifting. "You showed me leadership I should have shown from day one." Daniel's expression did not soften, but something in his posture shifted, a small acknowledgement, a silent acceptance. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. "I want you to be our chief test pilot. Full benefits, a schedule designed around your daughter. Whatever you need." Daniel inhaled slowly. "I'm a father first. Emma comes before everything." "As she should," Madison replied. "And we'll make sure she never loses that part of you again." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Madison offered something unexpected, a genuine smile, fragile but real. "Will you consider it?" "I will," he said simply. That evening, Madison invited Emma to the hangar. The little girl arrived wearing pink sneakers and a ponytail that bounced with every step. Daniel watched from a distance as Madison knelt before Emma and handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a perfectly crafted scale model of the Raven X9. "Your dad, Madison," said softly, "is the bravest man I've ever met. I wanted you to have this, so you always remember who he is." Emma's face lit up. "He doesn't need medals," she said proudly. "My daddy's a hero already." Madison's smile softened further. "You're right. He is." For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something warm stir inside him, something he had buried with his uniform and his medals and his past. Pride. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, rooted kind that comes from being seen, not for what you once were, but for who you are now. In the days that followed, employees approached him one by one, offering apologies, gratitude, or simply a handshake. Some cried. Some couldn't look him in the eye. Some, those who had laughed the loudest, struggled to find the right words. Daniel accepted each moment with the same steady grace. When Marcus approached him again later that week, he carried a sealed envelope. "This is from the board," he said. "A contract. Your contract." Daniel didn't open it. "I'll read it when I'm ready." Marcus nodded. "We'll wait." As Daniel walked across the hangar floor, the sunset cast a warm orange glow over the Raven X9. The machine stood tall, powerful, waiting. And for the first time, Daniel realized something profound. He wasn't stepping back into the sky to prove anything. He was stepping back because the sky had always been his home. And now at last, he was choosing it on his own terms, with his daughter's future steady in his hands, and a company finally starting to see him not as a janitor, not as a soldier, but as the pilot he was born to be. The launch day of the Raven X9 arrived wrapped in a tension that felt almost ceremonial. Before the sun fully climbed above the skyline, reporters clustered outside Aerodyne's headquarters cameras, pointed toward the entrance, like they were waiting for a myth to step through. Headlines spread quickly across the internet. The janitor who flew like a legend, a hidden hero at Aerodyne. The pilot no one saw coming. The world seemed eager to witness what would happen next. Inside the building, something had changed. Conversations carried less judgment and more warmth. People who used to walk past each other without acknowledgement now paused to exchange nods. The weight of hierarchy felt lighter, softened by the revelation that a man everyone overlooked had been extraordinary all along. Daniel Reeves hadn't set out to transform the company, but somehow he had. He arrived that morning wearing a Navy flight suit with his name embroidered neatly on the chest. Aerodyne had provided it for him. Yet as he pulled the zipper up, a familiar ache pressed against his ribs. He hadn't worn a suit like this since his days in the Air Force. It stirred memories, some painful, some grounding, but all reminders of who he used to be. When he stepped into the hangar, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversation stopped. People rose to their feet. But Daniel barely registered the attention before Emma, his daughter, ran toward him with her small model of the Raven in her hands. She grabbed his sleeve, her face glowing. "Daddy," she whispered, pointing behind him. "They put your name on the wall." Daniel turned slowly. Mounted near the hangar entrance was a polished plaque Chief Test Pilot Daniel Reeves. His chest tightened. In that simple engraving, he felt something settle inside him, a sense of being seen again, not as a janitor, not as a forgotten soldier, but as himself. As the hangar filled with reporters, engineers, executives, and international buyers, Madison Clark took her place at the podium. Gone was the distant CEO who once treated people like tools. Today she stood centered, calm, humbled. When she began to speak, her voice held a sincerity shaped not by authority, but by growth. She praised the years of innovation behind the Raven X9, but soon her attention shifted, her tone softening. "Before we unveil this aircraft," she said, "we must acknowledge the man who reminded us what courage truly looks like." She spoke about Daniel's military career, how he had risked everything to save others. She admitted her failures with a frankness rare in corporate halls. She apologized to him openly, acknowledging that she had judged him without ever knowing him. And when she finished, the applause filled the hangar with a raw, human gratitude. Then came the moment everyone had anticipated. Daniel walked toward the Raven X9 with a calmness that radiated through the room. He climbed into the cockpit, his hands gliding over the controls as though greeting old companions. When the engine roared to life, vibrations shuddered through the air, stirring loose papers and rustling jackets. The helicopter lifted smooth, confident, and the crowd gathered outside watched with breathless awe. High above the facility, Daniel guided the aircraft through a series of maneuvers that revealed the depth of his skill. Tight banks, clean arcs, controlled descents. Every movement was deliberate, powerful, and graceful. In the sky, he was unmistakably himself, steady, fearless, whole. When he returned and the skids touched the ground with gentle precision, the hangar erupted in applause. Emma sprinted into his arms, clinging to him with joy that made his throat tighten. She didn't care about the cameras or the spectacle. She cared only that her father had flown again. Madison stepped forward, hesitating slightly before speaking. He turned toward her eyebrows, raised, waiting. "Daniel," she said softly about that marriage proposal. A smile tugged at his lips. "I think we should start with coffee." Laughter rippled through the hangar, warm, relieved, genuine. Above them, the Raven X-9 shimmered beneath the lights. And in that moment, Daniel Reeves stood between the sky. He reclaimed the daughter he loved, and a future shaped not by rank or recognition, but by the quiet strength of a man who had finally been seen for who he truly was. In the end, Daniel's story reminds us that true greatness rarely announces itself. It often works quietly, humbly, tucked behind ordinary uniforms and unnoticed routines. As experts in human behavior have long observed, the most powerful form of leadership is the kind grounded not in authority, but in integrity. The kind Daniel embodied long before anyone recognized it. His journey teaches us that dignity requires no spotlight and character needs no title. If stories like this inspire you, encourage you, or shift the way you see the people around you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more narratives that reveal the extraordinary hidden in everyday lives. And before you go, drop a quick comment with just 3 words, a simple phrase that captures the heart of Daniel's journey: see the unseen.